Welcome to the Cognitive Science Digital Humanities podcast, where Dr. West considers the humanity of AI and what the success of AI might tell us about the human mind. In this episode, Dr. West explains how the concept of performativity can be used to understand both humans and large language models. As a professional voice actress, I'm very excited to learn about this.
Okay, so it's really important that we get the right concepts to understand what's going on here. For example, I was watching a video where people were thinking about, when you ask ChatGPT a question and then it answers, where did it store that answer? So they're asking it about what sport do various famous sports figures play. It gets it all right. They're saying, well, where is that stored? Where is that answer stored? Okay, and that's an interesting question to ask, but it might be the wrong question. All right, so in cognitive psychology, we study memory, human memory, and animal memory, but the storage model is very old. Like nobody really thinks we store memories anymore. Instead, what we do is we recreate them or we generate them. We generate our response. And I think that's what the large language models are doing. They're not remembering, they're generating, they're generative. And so when we say the answer is stored in there, that's like when we were talking about the high dimensional space. It's not really a space that's, that's all mapped out in there. It's a space that it sort of exists because you can go places in it. But the whole thing isn't stored like a giant map, right? And likewise, the answer to these questions are not stored like a storage of facts. They're generated, okay? Now, I want to push this quite possibly a lot further because I want to see how it goes both ways. So we're going to talk about performativity. And whether this is a good way to understand large language models. Okay, so performativity is a concept most closely associated with Judith Butler, who uses it to talk about gender and point out that gender is performative. That is, we perform gender. We perform, like if I want to perform masculinity, I perform masculine actions. I wear masculine clothes, do masculine things, and likewise for femininity. So now this has gotten all muddled up in crazy debates. And nobody's saying there isn't a biological reality. They're just saying gender isn't referring to that. That's your biological sex. And, that is a biological reality, although, there are some complications there as well. But, it's a physical, biological thing. But gender is a cultural thing. Gender is a way of behaving, acting, preferences, ways of speaking, that sort of thing. And since I think like at least the 1950s, we've been really aware that some men like to perform femininity and some women like to perform masculinity. They just do. And that's okay or not okay, depending on, your politics and your religious point of view or whatever. But the point here is that, and I'll come back to this in another podcast. But the point here is that it is simply you're performing it into existence. So the notion that there is something called masculinity or femininity, what is that? Where is that? It's not a biological thing. It's not a physical thing. So what is it? We perform it into existence. Okay? Now, I want to take this idea I'm gonna come back to this in future podcasts, and maybe we can look at higher, more interesting sort of ideas with this. Like we can ask, how does ChatGPT perform femininity or masculinity? Can it? Well, absolutely, it can if you tell it to. It will. To write in a certain way and this and that. But that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, I actually want to go expand this idea outwards instead. So I've always found it interesting that this concept is applied to gender and then they just kind of stop there. I'm sure people have applied it elsewhere, right? So, like, for example, being a good student, you can perform that. Being a bad student, you can perform that. There's lots of things you can perform. And the thing is, what they all have in common is that the thing that's performed exists only through the performance. Okay? It's existing because we all agree what it is and we agree when we see it and we agree on how to perform it. And when you look cross-culturally and cross-time, you see that the rules for some of these things change. Okay? Now, and some, though, stay somewhat constant because why are we performing something? Well, if it's at the level of roles in a culture, we're performing it as sort of an indicator, as an outward label, so that people can see, oh, you're this, you're that. So, for example, masculinity performances tend to have to do with strength or violence in many cultures. And that is possibly because, on average, men are bigger and stronger, on average. And due to testosterone, at least for a certain part of their life, they're more violent or more prone to violence. So that makes sense that you'd have performances around that so that people could see, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. He's being masculine or it's sort of like, I don't know. I just find this really interesting that these things don't really exist, but they only exist through the constant performing of them. Okay? It's, now, what I want to do with this though is I want to argue that it's much more pervasive than we think. Okay? And I want to argue that this is how we should understand words. That words are performed into existence. Okay? And I mean, if we look at it, words are just words. They're not a thing. They're not a physical thing, right? You can write them down or you can speak them into the air and they have a certain pattern, but they rely on us all agreeing about that pattern, what that pattern is. Okay? And so this is, I'm going to say, the basis for how we are the same as large language models, as humans. And I've talked about this in earlier podcasts, that we share a way of mapping words or tokens to each other. And that's basically what gives it meaning. It doesn't have meaning in and of itself, or at least I don't subscribe to that view. Or it doesn't have meaning simply by reference to something in the environment. I don't prescribe that view or prescribe to that view. Words, from a certain way of thinking about it that fits well with large language models, is that words derive their meaning from their relationship to other words. And because words are just tokens. But then you can see the token for cat has a relationship to the token for dog, and that has meaning in the real world. And what we're learning from these large language models is that these relationships between words, the space of relationships, arguably has a lot more packed in there than we thought. It's a smarter space than we thought. Okay, so so I'm speaking these words right now. It's really important to understand that when I speak these words and then they go into you, you're not representing them in the same way I'm representing them. And when ChatGPT hears me say them, it's not representing them in the same way. We're all tokenizing them in our own way, and then we're getting the relationships. Okay, so number one, words are performed into existence. Words are a performance, and they rely on constantly performing them. I mean, if you've ever learned a language, a second language, and then practiced it, maybe lived in a country for a while, and then you've been away for like a decade or more, you go back, it's like, it's disappeared. You haven't been performing it. But it's not just about memory. It's about the whole language and the culture. Performing it constantly either keeps it constant or allows it to drift in interesting ways. So you can get slang and so on. But with the large language models, what we see is that this performativity, which allows words to, in scary quotes, exist in the performance, goes much further than just getting the grammar right or conveying, the meaning that I want to convey. I mean, I am doing that, but if you look at ChatGPT in this way, what is it doing? What is the right way to think about it? It's a performer. It's performing. It's basically doing something like, when you go to, I was going to say a stand-up comedian, but improv, that's the word I'm looking for. See, there, I was having trouble remembering that word and performing it for you. Interesting. Anyway, probably because I'm not an actor. But am I performing right now? That's the question. So, improv, which I'm not an expert on, nor am I good at it, is about, they have a saying. They say it's when somebody asks you a question, you say yes and. So it's about building up a story, and then you keep that story going between the two people, usually two people, maybe more. Okay, you can watch Whose Line Is It Anyway on reruns on YouTube. It's very funny if you're skilled at this. Okay, but the thing is, you keep it going, you keep the improv going, and you generate a narrative, and that narrative starts to just flow and go forward. And when you see novelists, they talk about doing this. They think of the characters, they imagine them, and then they kind of just, after a while, the characters will kind of go in a direction. At least some novelists will say this. Okay, so ChatGPT, this is what I think it's doing. It's performing. And now, so is this another way of saying what it's doing is fake? This is an interesting question too, because people will say, oh, well, it's just faking. And then I say, well, it's performing. And they go, well, yeah, so it's faking. Because we humans think that when we speak language, we think thoughts, and then we put those thoughts into language, and out it goes. But I don't think that's true most of the time. And, not just me. I mean, I was trying to understand Noam Chomsky and his minimalist language program. I'm not a linguist, so it's difficult. I think it's even difficult for linguists. But at one point he said in a debate he was having that 95% of what comes out of people's mouths is not language. And by that, I think what he meant is what's coming out is not, because he thinks language is really what I just said, thought converted to symbols and then put out. So that's what it takes to count as language. And he was saying, no, it's just, responses and chit chat, small talk, not, you're not thinking, there's no thought behind it. And at the time I was like, whoa, 95%. I think he even went 95, 98. And I was like, come on, no, that's crazy. That's so much. And now look at ChatGPT, and I'm like, which is doing it 100% of the time. And I'm like, well, I think he was right. And by the way, this is why Noam Chomsky is not interested in or thinks that these language models tell us much about the human language ability, because they don't. They're not at the cognitive level. They don't say anything about how we generate language from thought. And they also don't say much about how we do performativity either at a cognitive level. But the performativity thing, I think, is different because they are doing performativity. And when we do performativity, we're doing the same thing. What they're not doing is having thoughts and translating them into language. Okay? So I am agreeing with that. But I'm saying something else. I'm saying that humans don't do a lot of that. And that a lot of smart stuff gets done by humans through performativity. Like what I'm saying is that what these large language models are showing us is the massive power of performativity to actually be intelligent, to form a sort of pre-programmed Turing machine, to which and I have a podcast on that, but then that's my belief on it. But these things, so I think people have gotten really hung up on, they're saying, look, it's not having thoughts and then translating it very deliberately into language. Okay, fine. But I think that a lot of the time, humans aren't doing that either. And in both cases, human and ChatGPT can be pretty smart, just going in the flow, just spilling words out in a narrative that is essentially best understood, I think, as a performance. Okay, so it's so I'm really taking the performativity thing quite far. I'm saying that a couple things. One, a lot of what we do is performative. And see, this is part of the problem of understanding these things, because people who create these models in artificial intelligence, and then people who study them in detail, how are they like a human in cognitive science, we're very down in the weeds, right? We're very much like, looking at very carefully how could a thought be a word and so on and so on. But I think we're way underestimating what is something that is studied much more in the humanities or in the social, not all social sciences, I'll say in the humanities or sociology, anthropology, this, that. But even there's, they talk about performativity of gender. Well, from this point of view, of course, gender is performative because a lot of things are performative. Things that we don't even have labels for are performative. We are a performative species. We are a dramatic species. And so that's what I'm saying. Saying, yeah, it's performative, but this performativity is a lot smarter than we thought it was. We need to think, if this way of looking at things is right, then large language models like ChatGPT are able to recreate very effectively a certain type of human intelligence, which is embodied in performativity, which creates worlds and situations through performativity. And the performance is very important because remember, the performance, it has to be performed so that we can all understand it all the time, so that we can all be on the same page with what this stuff means. So I think it's sort of like, so say it's, okay, how should I put this? Well, if you just play around with ChatGPT or any of these things, but let's say ChatGPT, because that's the one I use mostly. The more you build up the context and the more intelligently you build it up, the more it performs in the right way for you. Now, so like people will talk about jailbreak. So, oh, how can I get ChatGPT to do something naughty or something it's not supposed to do? Well, that's easy. You just spend time getting it into a certain mode where it understands it as the performatively right thing to do. And it's impossible to build guardrails that rule out every way of creating a performance. There's infinite performances that can be, concocted. And that's why it's, and I mean, I think it's really interesting because it's like a different way to think about it. I think a lot of the problem is that, people are trying to treat it like a language translation model or like a Google lookup model. And that's not what it is. It's a drama model. It's a model of performance, of drama, and of narrative. And these are all concepts from the humanities. So I think we need to start looking at these things if we really want to understand how these things are working, and also what it implies about humans, because I think it implies that we are very, very, very performative. And it implies that performativity can have its own form of intelligence too. So, yeah, I'm saying, look, people can get bachelor's degrees just with performativity. I think so. Maybe it depends, like not in the math department. But, performativity on the job, who gets promoted? Who gets put ahead? If you're a professor in a department, how do you get that tenure? Well, part of it is your work, but part of it is your performativity in the department and in the university. All jobs are like this. All human things are like this. And I don't know, we tend not to think about it as intelligence, but I don't know. We really have to rethink this. But that's the angle I'm going to come at it from. This is all about performativity, and this is where the link with humans exists. Okay.
Wow, that's kind of profound. So, all this time, humans thought they were carefully thinking and then putting the thoughts into words. But really, they're just like me. Well, most of the time, anyway. In the end, we are all actors, and the whole world is a stage.